Our man Gerry Dulac here at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette wrote a piece where saying he thinks that Mike Tomlin's job looks safe and that another extension could be coming pretty soon. We'll talk about that because there's also some conflicting, uh, thought pieces from our columnists. We had Ron Cook, Paul Zeiss talking about the coaching decisions and the Steelers' way. Is it the right way right now? To talk about that with me, we have Brian Batko, one of our great Steelers beat writers, here on the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Let's get into it.
You are now listening to the North Shore Drive podcast, a show on all things Pittsburgh sports from the writers of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, hosted by Christopher Carter.
Hello, welcome to the North Shore Drive podcast. I'm Chris Carter from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, breaking things all down here on the Pittsburgh sports scene with all of our Pittsburgh Post-Gazette writers. You can find this show on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and especially on YouTube. If you enjoy this show, like the video if you're enjoying it. Subscribe to this channel to get all of the daily content that comes out from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, as well as our Monday, Wednesday, and Friday episodes of the North Shore Drive podcast. Joining us today, we normally have him on Fridays. We're switching it up. We got Brian Batko here on a Wednesday. And Brian, how you doing, sir?
I'm doing well, Chris. How are you?
I'm doing just dandy. Getting ready to go talk to our good people at Pitt at their training facility on the South Side. But
have you been working on the pronunciation of the quarterback, the backup? Veilleux.
I'm trying. We're trying to get Christian Veilleux's name right. We're gonna get it today. But
yeah, a lot of people have trouble pronouncing Phil Jerkovic too, and he's been a big name around these parts for like a decade. I still see people called Jerkovic. I see people spell his name wrong. Yeah, I mean, hey, but we're talking about, the same kind of audience that has still misspelled James Conner with an O at the end for a really long time. So those are just pet peeves of mine. Mispronouncing Christian Veilleux is a little bit, that's more forgivable.
You get that? You're like, I'm going to say this right. You stop for a second and then get it right every time.
It's respecting the cultures and backgrounds of others to say and spell their names correctly.
I have to say Uiagalelei a lot, covering the ACC, so that's one. But let's talk about the other team that trains on the South Side in the same facility. That's the Pittsburgh Steelers, of course. And it's been an interesting week, just kind of just thinking things through and hearing things. Gerry Dulac, our guy here, he writes that Mike Tomlin's job looks like it's going to be safe. Another extension could be coming, which tracks. I mean, that's what the Steelers do. They have the policy of re-signing a coach 2 years before their extension comes up, so that they're never in a season. I presume this is why, so that they're never in a season where the coach is coaching while wondering, is this their last year? And Art Rooney did kind of say, he liked the direction of the team and how it ended up on a positive note at the end of the season. And he said he wouldn't get into Mike Tomlin's coaching contracts, and he doesn't do that. But I think Jerry's pretty much right that as long as Mike Tomlin wants to keep coaching, the Rooneys are going to, Mr. Rooney, Art Rooney II, is going to say, hey, yeah, we'll happily take you on here. But there's also been some conflicting thought pieces from our columnists. Ron Cook questioned in one of his columns that came out Wednesday morning, is the Steelers' way the wrong way? And he talked about how historically there's this has been a thing, but there's times to question if the Steelers' way is the right way. Bringing up Mike Tomlin's recent record and obviously the lack of playoff wins in the last several years. And then our friend Paul Zeiss also wrote, talking about the Philadelphia Eagles, who just made their second Super Bowl since the 2016 season, excuse me. Since the 2016 season, and he's talked about their bold coaching decisions have led them back to the promised land, where Nick Sirianni is now in the Super Bowl with the Eagles, and Doug Peterson was in the Super Bowl with the Eagles after they many years after they fired Andy Reid, and then fired Chip Kelly, and then fired the guy that replaced Chip Kelly, and then got Doug Peterson. But it's an interesting perspective here to look on either side of this. Are the Steelers doing something that's needless to keep up the 2 year, just the beyond Tomlin himself, the 2 year coaching rehire, renegotiation, re-signing tradition? Has that outlived its purpose, if it ever had a purpose?
Yeah, I think it has. I mean, I understand wanting to negotiate with players when they're going into the last year of their deal. I kind of get that self-imposed philosophy, policy, whatever you want to call it. You don't want to negotiate in season. We know that's a long-standing tenet of how the Steelers do business. And I think from a personal aspect, you don't want guys being distracted by that to a degree. So that I kind of get. But, Tomlin signed through 2024. It's not like next year would be his last one under contract anyway.
Right.
I don't think the recent results have justified giving him that extra kind of assurance that you normally do, because if so, and if you take Art Rooney II at his word, telling Steelers.com that all he evaluates on Tomlin on really is that he's happy he's their coach, how do you paint that other than the guy essentially has a lifetime contract with the organization? Like, that's a big, that's a big step to take, I think, to that degree. So I'm not a fire Tomlin guy. I do think that there's something to, does a coach's message or way of doing things, can it get stale, through no fault of his own? I think if anybody's going to be the test for that, the ultimate case study of coaches getting stale, it's probably a guy like Tomlin who brings that energy and that juice day in and day out, from player number 1 to player number 53, heck, probably player number 69 on the practice squad. We know how he operates and how much he loves this, but can things run their course, and can a jolt of new energy and new life kind of help an organization get to these heights like the Eagles? But I know we were talking off air a little bit that, as much as you want to point to the Eagles of saying, look, you can do it this way, you also have to look at teams like the Browns and the Texans, Lions, who've been a revolving door of coaches. It hasn't worked nearly as well for them. So the Steelers, they have a way of thinking. They have a mentality about this that has mostly worked for them for the last 60 some years. And I think it's going to be really difficult for Art Rooney to move off of that. And I don't blame him for that. But I also think that at times it's not the worst thing in the world to take a step back, reconsider the way you do things, and say, maybe Mike shouldn't get an extension this year, and we can revisit it next year when we see how he does in 2023.
No, and listen, I agree. Taking a step back can be the right move. Always evaluating, thinking about things, and not necessarily just sticking to it. But part of it maybe they are taking a step back and saying, you know what, this is the guy that they want long term. Because your question about the message growing stale, that's a narrative that I've heard a lot about Mike Tomlin, message growing stale.
I think you hear it about any coach once they've been on a job for
exactly. It's the natural
years,
thing that
let alone
we just say.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. Everyone says that about a coach that's been around a team for as long as Mike Tomlin has, and it doesn't even take as long as Mike Tomlin's been on the team to bring that up. But I'd hear that if the team was giving up in seasons, like if the team had fallen apart this year and they'd finished with 4 or 5 wins, then I'd be like, okay, maybe it did. But I mean, this team rallied and won. And granted, yes, the second half of the season, the schedule of their season wasn't full of juggernauts or anything, but they were able to fight and win games with a rookie quarterback and in those situations. I think it shows it's not actually falling apart. And to Paul's example with the Eagles, and he and I talked about this on Twitter last week. I brought up, people were talking about Doug Peterson, and Doug Peterson got fired after winning a Super Bowl. The Eagles made the right move, and that's what the Steelers should do, just fire coaches as soon as they have a bad year. I'm like, well, wait a second. Mike Tomlin this year was 9-8. Doug Peterson's last year was 4-11-1, and he had like a near mutiny on the sideline where multiple players were trying to confront him because he was benching Jalen Hurts in the final game of the season, and Jalen Hurts was upset about that. And there was a lot of questions from people that were even captains on the team. And so the Eagles saw that 4-win season and saw that chaos on the sideline and thought, you know what? We're gonna ride with the guy we think is the quarterback of the future. And
Nate Sudfeld and his family were pretty pumped about it.
Right. Nate Sudfeld was happy that he got to go in over Jalen Hurts, who is the quarterback that is now taking them to the Super Bowl. I look at that and I say, that's a very different situation. If Mike Tomlin ever did lose the locker room like that, if Cam Hayward was trying to confront Mike Tomlin on the sideline, I think that would be a very different situation. But we've never seen that. We've also never seen a 4-win season or less under with the Steelers since 1969, and I think that's part of why the Steelers way. I think it depends on who classifies what is the Steelers way, because you could say the Steelers way is this, that, and the third. I think the Steelers way is trusting your coach to pull them out, and if they're doing the job and they're holding up that the standard to keep them in the fight and at least keep them building towards something, I think that is worth it. But I don't think it's guaranteed, because, like you said, for every Eagles organization that, they churned through some coaches and they've had some recent success, I think that's more about the core that they've kept around guys like Jason Kelsey, Fletcher Cox, and the players that kind of have been able to set the tone for that organization over the past 7 years.
And their front office has been the same too, correct?
Yeah, exactly. The front office, Andy Weidel, I think that's why the Steelers went and got him, because he was part of that front office. And the Steelers recognize, hey, the way that they're bringing in prospects, maybe we should be doing that as part of our process. And I think that is part of seeing forward a little bit there, and that's the Steelers willing to adapt. But I think even beyond the Texans and the Browns and the Cardinals and all those organizations, I think a perfect example of the counter of the Eagles is the Giants. Tom Coughlin was a guy who he would struggle for about 2 or 3 years and then rise up and win a Super Bowl. He did that twice for them. And then after back-to-back 6 and 10 seasons, they called it quits, and people were wondering, did they do that a little too soon, because this is the guy that won them 2 Super Bowls? Well, lo and behold, they brought in Ben McAdoo, made the playoffs for a season, then they got embarrassed, and then they went 3-13, and since then they've been just churning out coaches, Shermer, then Judge, and they finally get one at Joe Dable that takes them 9-7-1 into the playoffs, finishing 3rd in their division.
Brian Dable, don't short us Brian's, Chris.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We need our credit.
I apologize.
If his name was anything else, I would have let it slide. I need to stick up for a fellow bearded, short Brian.
He's short. I never paid attention to
I think he's pretty short. I'm going to look that up.
But point being, it took them a long time of churning through the coaches to get to this point that we're still not sure if it's actually working out. They beat the Vikings in a playoff game because they played in a lesser conference. But I look at this and I say, like, I'm not so sure that everything is as straightforward as is there. We're going to keep this conversation going because we got to talk about that. And I also want to talk to Brian about Tom Brady officially retiring here this week on the first day of Black History Month.
Three quick Google results. One says he's 5'10", one says he's 5'8", one says he's 5'5". So we need to get to the top of Brian Dable. Yes.
We got to get to the bottom of this right here on the North Shore Drive podcast. We'll do that in a minute here, but first, we're going to talk to you guys about one of our great sponsors, Valley Pool & Spa. Would it be nice if the holidays were stress-free? You can get a hot tub, a swim spa, or a sauna from Valley Pool & Spa to help you feel like it is nice to be stress-free. The cold has gotten back here, Brian. It's snowing. It's icy. I'm having to scrape off my car. I hate it. If only I had a nice sauna, hot tub, or swim spa from Valley Pool & Spa to help me kind of relax and forget about having to scrape off.
I didn't even realize how cold it was because I have a garage, which is like a sauna for your car. So
that is nice. Yeah. And so actually that would be nice to have. And if you want a sauna for yourself, you can get a Finleo sauna that's going to help you handle your stress, feel relaxed, and forget about the cold outside right in your own home. Save big now on in-stock hot tubs, swim spas, and saunas at valleypoolspa.com. That's valleypoolspa.com. Back here on the North Shore Drive podcast from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Brian Batko, our Steelers beat writer. Brian, let's keep this discussion going because, my going back through this, and listen, again, I'm not against anyone questioning if the Steelers way is right or if the Steelers could look at a thing there. But I also think that, I look back to how people say Art Rooney, he's handling things differently than the other Rooneys, and the other Rooneys wouldn't do this. But I remember as a kid, and you can even kind of look this up with some of the articles that this paper wrote back around this time. But when the Steelers had just missed the playoffs for 3 seasons in a row, Bill Cowher had 2 losing seasons and then finished 9-7 in 2000. He got an extension, and a lot of people questioned, was that the right move? Why are you doing this with a coach that isn't bringing you the results? And Dan Rooney's reason is, well, they finished strong in 2000, and he felt like that the locker room was building something, and that they were centering around Cowher at the time. And I look at that reasoning and I compare it very much to the 9-8 finish the Steelers had this year, where they're finding the new core that they're trying to build around. Back then, it was Cordell Stewart and trying to figure things out with Hines Ward and Alan Faneca and Joey Porter and guys like that. They were building that. And this Steelers core, you already knew you had Minkah Fitzpatrick, TJ Watt, and Cam Hayward, but now you're finding Kenny Pickett, Najee Harris, Pat Fryermuth, George Pickens. All those guys are coming together, and you're trying to invest to even build that even bigger. I actually don't think that that Art Rooney II has changed that much from the past guys, and that's part of, quote unquote, the Steelers' way. I actually think he's keeping to the blueprint that got them their last Super Bowl and has kept them a competitor for the last 24 years.
Yeah, I think you make a good point that clearly they're happy with the general overall state of things, the sustained success from basically, 1970 till now. But if you want to narrow that window a little bit, go back to, 04, no losing seasons since then. But I think to play devil's advocate of that, it would be to ask, okay, how long do you continue down this road of essentially saying, well, this has worked for us before, and we're confident that it's going to get us back to the promised land? How long do you say that, essentially? I mean, I think you can do everything that you just mentioned, Chris, build this young core, allow Mike Tomlin to steer you into the next era, the next generation of Steelers football, without essentially giving him a piece of paper this offseason that says, hey, man, you're good for life.
There's no worries there.
Right. Because I think the other thing you can ask here, in addition, beyond saying, okay, you finished strong, you went 9-8, you showed us what we wanted to see down the stretch. You could also say, why haven't you reached a level higher than the divisional round of the playoffs in 6 years? You can look at that from a granular perspective of, okay, Le'Veon Bell was out in this game. Ben Roethlisberger went down in this season. Antonio Brown lost his mind this year, and that kind of harpoon things. But you could also look at it from a more big picture perspective of, are we still capable of reaching those heights? Are we still capable of hitting that ceiling with the power structure we have in place? I don't know. I mean, clearly, I think another contract extension this offseason for Tomlin would indicate that the Steelers and the decision makers believe that they very much are capable of doing that under his leadership as the head coach. To again, kind of, play devil's advocate a little bit when you're talking about how the strong finish to this season could be means to justify a new deal for him. Why didn't we say the opposite coming off of 2020 when they fell apart down the stretch? That he didn't lose the team, per se, because they still won the AFC North, and it was a 1-4 finish against some decent competition, but they collapsed at the end and then got hammered in the playoff game against the Browns. What happened that offseason? He got a contract extension. So that's where I think some of the frustration comes in from people who think, there's a fire Mike Tomlin contingent out there. Those people exist for whatever reason, some fair, some not so fair. But even people like me who think he can still be the guy for the job, but you need to put a little bit of pressure on him going into next season. There's no need to essentially double down on this guy's set for life as our head coach.
No, and that's the interesting thing here too, is that, like you said, his last season wouldn't be 2023, it'd be 2024. So it's like this season there wouldn't be pressure on him to be like, oh, if you don't get it done here, this is it.
There'd be a right amount of pressure, in my opinion.
Right, there would be a sense of that there. And again, let's go back to one of the first things you said on this show today. We're not guaranteeing that he is getting an extension. This was just Gerry writing his thoughts and his opinions, for the Post-Gazette. Gerry Dulac, of course, that being. So that could be a thing here. I just, I hear that entirely. And if that's your statement, that there's no need to push it at that point, I agree. I'm of the opinion, I've made it no secret, I think Mike Tomlin is doing a heck of a job as a coach to kind of keep the Steelers afloat. I also think that, if you're realistically looking at the past few teams, it's tough to say which team was supposed to go deep in the playoffs, because a lot of these teams, even this year's team with $36 million in dead cap space, were tied up by Ben Roethlisberger's contract, and when Ben Roethlisberger either wasn't playing or wasn't playing
Yeah.
that well.
That was a really difficult thing for the Steelers to navigate at that point in time.
Yeah.
I think in retrospect, it's hard to say if you're a longtime Steelers fan who loved and appreciated 7, but in retrospect, if that 2019 elbow injury happens and he says, you know what, guys, I think this is it for me. I think this is a career ender, really could have jump-started the process of rebuilding. I don't think you get those 2 middling, mediocre years with Ben on his final legs and arm. But after the 2020 loss to the Browns, I don't think anybody wanted to see Ben go out like that, especially Ben himself. So I don't blame them for continuing down that road for him to finish out his contract. But I think we can all agree that the 2021 team was never going to get to a point that you think, man, this was the last great Steelers season. Like, they just didn't have that potential with the way Ben was playing. So it really was a catch-22 of, we're the Steelers, we're a patient organization, we want to see this through for one of our franchise greats, versus time is of the essence. And I know there were people saying it at the time, prominent people, former players. Ike Taylor was one who definitely stands out to me, of basically being like, look, it's cool that Ben's staying, but look what the Bengals are building. Look what the Ravens are building. You're losing ground to these teams in your division every year that you do this. So now they're kind of reaping what they sowed in that regard. Sown? Whatever.
No, it's sown. Yes, sown.
Sued. They're reaping what they sowed.
Vayud.
But
in all seriousness, part of it, you go back to the contract. They renegotiated and extended Ben Roethlisberger in 2019, just before the injury. Like that's how. That's unfortunate. You can't.
Bad
see
timing.
that. Yeah, that's just, you can't see that coming, and that's part of it. And again, you then tied yourself in 2019. You don't want a single game. You go 8-6 without him, but you don't want a single game with him in that situation. And he's taking up the biggest chunk of your salary cap space. 2020. And here's the crazy part: if you're right, if he says right then and there, I'm done, that was it, I think I'm over. Guess who they could get in the 2020 draft? Even with that second round pick, Jalen Hurts. Instead of going to getting Chase Claypool, they passed on Jalen Hurts. And the reason I think they did pass on Jalen Hurts is because they thought Ben Roethlisberger was coming back. And again, this isn't to say Ben's to blame for everything, but it's a very real situation that their roster has been built around him, and he hasn't been a carrying factor for this team for quite some time. Even back in 2017 when he was playing well, I always point out to people, he hasn't had a drive in the playoffs where they were either tied or down by a possession that has resulted in a touchdown since the Miami Dolphins playoff win in the wild card round in 2016.
Yeah, the way I would frame it is that it's not that Ben is to blame, but I think the challenge of navigating the twilight of Ben's career is to blame for a lot of basically the mediocrity of these last few years.
Also accompanied by losing players that looked very good, like Ryan Shazier, Stephon Tuitt, David DeCastro, Marquise Pouncey. You kind of see coming, but those last 3 guys, they thought that they were going to have them for several years when their careers ended. So you lose all pro players. I'm not sure if Tuitt made all pro, but he had 11.5 sacks last year.
He was all pro caliber at times, for sure.
Exactly. And you combine that with also navigating it, I think that's where, again, going back to Tomlin, that's where it's like, hey, you know what? This team should have folded several times over the past few years and just kind of fell off into losing record territory, and they haven't. And maybe that's what Rooney's hanging on to and saying, you know what? If he's able to fight through these times, imagine when he's not hampered down by a year where they have $36 million in dead cap space because they're tied to retired players. And imagine if he doesn't lose his defensive MVP, what could he do with that situation?
My last rebuttal to that would be, it's the NFL. Things happen every year.
Exactly.
So things, injuries, unexpected departures, you need to work through that. But yeah, certainly hear what you're saying, that when you look at 2022 in a vacuum, there were a lot of obstacles that they had to overcome. And, they did to some extent, but obviously not enough to get the
playoffs. Right. Not enough to do that. We're always going to keep track of this kind of stuff to see just how they keep doing. And if an extension does come in this offseason, if it does, I'm sure it will be revisiting this conversation. But it's one of those things that will never end in talking about in Pittsburgh Nation until they do someday move on from Mike Tomlin. Who knows if we'll be alive by then? But let's talk. Let's switch topics. I want to talk to Brian about one, Tom Brady retiring and what we've seen at the Senior Bowl so far. Tom Brady's officially retired. I think he says for good, but we've been down this road before. But we'll talk about that in a minute here on the North Shore Drive podcast. But first, we can talk to you guys about our great sponsors at Yinzers in the Berg. So Yinzers, listen up. If you're a Penguins fan, you're a Steelers fan, you're a Pirates fan, you're anything Pittsburgh sports, you gotta go to Yinzers in the Berg, the #1 place to go to for all your Pittsburgh sports apparel, accessories, and much, much more. With the Penguins, they're going to try to make their second half push just to keep up the longest playoff streak in sports history. If you want to support them in doing that, you can get all the Penguins gear that you want at Yinzers in the Berg. And they have 2 stores in the Strip District that you can go to as you go to throughout the week. But if you can't make it there, if you're out of town and you're listening to the show, go to yinzerspgh.com. It's Yinzers in the Berg's website that updates every week with new merchandise celebrating Pittsburgh sports and all your favorite players and teams from this area. Again, that's yinzerspgh.com or either of their stores in the Strip District. For Yinzers in the Berg, your #1 place for Pittsburgh sports apparel, accessories, and much more. Back here in the North Shore Drive podcast, Chris Carter, Brian Batko from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. We're talking things here. Brian, as long as Mike Tomlin's been in the league, there's been a Tom Brady. And it appears maybe this time that he's actually done and retired and finished. We thought we did this dance last year when he announced his retirement and people were doing their, Tom Brady things. But now a year later, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, they have they made the playoffs, but it wasn't exactly pretty. They had a losing record. They got stomped by the Cowboys. Tom Brady looked as pedestrian as ever. Heck, the Steelers, his team was the one team the Steelers beat this year when TJ Watt wasn't on the field. And it's crazy to think with all the times that he's just walked into Heinz Field / Acrisure Stadium. Well, I guess it would have been just Heinz Field because they just changed the name. So all the times he walked into Heinz Field and just stomped the hearts of Steelers fans and the teams throughout the years. And then to see that version of Tom Brady playing, I get the sense, I do think this is it, though. I think that if he looks at the way he's playing, he does see it's very different here. A lot of people are talking about, he's going to go to the Niners. He's going to go here. He's going to go there. I'm just like, man, like the Niners maybe, but they want an athletic quarterback. They want someone that can move and take the hits of playing on a more physical team. I do think it's smart for Tom Brady to walk away, and maybe he walked away just one season too late.
I say 2 seasons too late. You know, if you go out on top with that Super Bowl win, I mean, how can you beat that? But that's always the double-edged sword of being a competitor. You win one, you feel like I'm still the best at what I do. Why am I going to leave now? So actually kind of ties in a little bit to, what we were just talking about with the final days of Ben Roethlisberger. I mean, neither guy went out at the top of their game. Obviously, Brady is unfortunately going to have to wear that 19-12 loss to who did they lose to? Oh, the Cowboys. They got wrecked, right? Yeah, Cowboys lost 19-12 the next week to the Niners. But Brady's going to have to, he's going to have to sit on that forever. Doesn't cheapen his legacy or anything like that, obviously, but not a storybook ending for him. And yeah, it was pretty emotional, the video that he posted to Twitter on Wednesday morning. You could tell that he was choking back some tears, either a really heartfelt message from a polarizing figure or somebody who knows that he had to put on a good acting job before he goes and joins Josh McDaniels for the Raiders. But I mean, you got to think that he's done now. If not, it really will hurt his legacy, I think, with some people if he actually does pull a fast one again and goes full Brett Favre on us and retires and unretires for a second time. But I guess my main takeaway from this is guys such as Josh Jackson, Elijah Riley, and Quincy Wilson and James Pierre made sure that Tom Brady did not get the last laugh against the Steelers. Always give it up to them. Because you remember, that was the game that the Steelers were missing. Minkah Fitzpatrick and Witherspoon, Cam Sutton, pretty much everybody.
I could not believe that they actually won the game. I remember I always park downtown and then take the T to the stadium because it drops you off right there where I need to go for the media entrance. And on my way there, people are all like, "Hey, you're Chris Carter." do they even have a chance today? And I was like, man, it's hard
Do
to see
people
one.
stop you in public a lot like that, Chris? We're
Not
just
to
on
brag.
Steelers game days.
No, not to brag, but it does happen quite a
How
bit
do you
now.
how do you even go out like to eat or go get gas? Go to the
Guys,
grocery store?
guys. No,
Do you have people go to the grocery store for you?
no, I do not do that.
What
I'm not that.
Tomlin said a couple years ago, right? That he hasn't been to a grocery store in like 10 years. You remember that?
Yeah, I do remember that. He also used to go out to bars a little bit more in the area back in the day. Like, they used to read the occasional story of him walking in and buying everyone a tab if they didn't bother him. Now you don't see him do that anymore because it's a little different when you've been coaches somewhere for 15 years. But no. I'm always very happy, and I think it's very nice. Pittsburgh is a wonderful city. I mean, you and I grew up in this area. I think that people are very nice in this city, and it's different, because people love their sports, and when they see you and they were like, hey, just like your stuff, and I always appreciate that when people do that. So
I was actually talking to TJ Watt last summer. I think it was
okay.
about the pickleball thing, and he made a point to say that he loves Pittsburgh because he can go to the grocery store and people notice him, but they really don't bother him.
Yeah. Right, and I think that's like no one's ever been like, "Oh my god," to me because I'm also not a player. I'm just a guy.
Yeah, I mean, if TJ gets to your level someday, it might be a different story.
Right.
But otherwise, he's okay.
But point being, with Tom Brady and getting back to his talk, my whole thing on this is I can't blame Tom Brady for sticking around. And I know that there's the divorce and the family stuff that came around that. I don't like to make fun of that or make light of that because that's personal stuff. That's family things and that's life stuff. I don't want to jab at that. But it's hard for me to get on a guy who. Imagine how many times in Tom Brady's years someone said, "Dude, it's over. Like just stop." Like you, even before he got to be Tom Brady, when he was a 6th-round pick out of Michigan. Like, come on, man. You don't run fast. You don't got a cannon arm. You're playing behind Drew Bledsoe. You're never gonna get a shot. And then even after he won his first 3 Super Bowls, he said, "You could have hung it up, man. You got 3 Super Bowls. You're going to the Hall of Fame. You're legendary." And then each time with the Patriots in the 2010s, how many times he could have retired. And then even after he won his 6th Super Bowl with the Patriots, he could have done it again. And he said, "No, I'm going to go somewhere else and do it." And who's to tell that man who won a 7th Super Bowl with the Buccaneers that, hey, you can't do this again? And let's not forget that last year when they were in the playoffs and they were a competitive team, they barely lost to the eventual Super Bowl champion Los Angeles Rams. So I can't blame Tom Brady for sticking around too much. I just think it's interesting. I just think it's it's interesting that we that this has happened. Now we'll see if he actually is retired in some time. But last thing here,
here's the conversation on that front that you're not ready for, Chris. Who is the quarterback for the Buccaneers next season, and why is it Mitch Trubisky?
Dang, I wasn't ready for that conversation. Or is it Mason Rudolph? That could be crazy. We could be seeing a Steeler go lead in Tampa. All right, Brian. Last thoughts here. You've had a chance to kind of sit back, read what our friend Ray Fittipaldo is writing in Mobile, Alabama. We'll have Ray on the Friday episode of the North Shore Drive podcast because he's
Ray doubling up this week. Wow.
Yeah, doubling up Ray. He gave us a preview of the Senior Bowl. He'll be the last practice is Thursday. So we've had day 1 practice we saw yesterday. Day 2 is like right now, and then day 3 will be tomorrow. The practices are what people mostly pay attention to. The game itself is kind of cool to watch just to see how things play out. But what has been your read on the players that you've seen or the things that you've seen coming out of the Senior Bowl this week?
Well, first of all, if you're going to have Ray on the show twice in 1 week, then the second time you need to call him Ray Fittipaldo. Add a second Ray. So far from reading Ray's piece on the offensive lineman that he did early in the week, I went into this draft cycle thinking that if the Steelers are going to take an O-lineman, especially high, they should get one with some position flexibility. They really don't have that among their starters right now. Like Chuksa Okorafor, they kind of tried the whole left tackle thing with him. It either didn't work or they just decided that it wasn't the right time. But either way, he's never really moved off that right tackle spot for whatever reason. Seems like he's comfortable over there. Dan Moore, maybe he could slide inside to guard, but mostly a tackle in college. And that's obviously all he's done so far at this level. Kevin Dotson is strictly a guard. James Daniels and Mason Cole, I think they've got versatility, but they're pretty well entrenched in their spots right now in their NFL careers. So I think a guy like a Peter Skoronsky or Paris Johnson, if they're there, would be intriguing because they have played multiple spots on the line in college, if I'm not mistaken. However, I can't, and I assume Mike Tomlin and the Steelers brass are having some of these thoughts too. You can't not see a guy like DeJuan Jones from Ohio State in the physical profile and not salivate a little bit over what he could bring you. I mean, he's 6'8", he's got the longest wingspan, that they've ever seen at the Senior Bowl. I know Ray was chatting about that on Monday. I wonder about the fit because I think he's strictly a right tackle, but man, you just have to imagine getting somebody like that in here would fit a lot of what the Steelers believe in terms of large people up front and coaching, sharpening those physical attributes.
No, I hear you that as I deal with sun issues here on camera, breaking through my blackout curtains here in my office. But no, I'm right with you on that. And this is something that I think is interesting about the Senior Bowl group, because when you look at a lot of big boards and the top 17 players, because the Steelers picked 17th overall this year, there's only like one senior that usually pokes through, and I think it's the edge rusher from Texas Tech, Tyree. His name is escaping me.
Tyree Wilson, yeah.
Tyree Wilson. He's the one guy that's a senior. That a lot of the guys that the Steelers could be looking at this year are underclassmen, and I know
they're not in Mobile.
Right, in Mobile, excuse me. But a lot of the guys, I know that you look at the last 2 years. Kenny Pickett, Senior Bowl guy. Najee Harris, Senior Bowl guy. So people are probably thinking, well, maybe it's going to be another Senior Bowl guy. I'm not so sure the first round pick is, but the 32nd overall pick, the 50th overall pick, the 80th overall pick, those guys might be there. And DeJuan Jones, he had a really good rep against Andre Carter, one of the better edge rushers of this class that's expected to be a late first or early second round pick. And he kind of dominated him there. So he had a good look. But, Matthew Bergeron, the Syracuse offensive tackle, he had some really good reps there at the offensive tackle position. But also guys like, in other positions, Julius Brents was phenomenal as a cornerback in the first day as a cornerback. And he's a very Ike Taylorish build of 6'4", kind of stocky at like 200 some pounds. There's going to be a lot of different guys that you can look at this year at different positions. Because remember, the Steelers, they have a lot of needs. You could go offensive line, defensive line, and there were some guys there like Keanu Benton and Carl Brooks who looked really good. You could go backup edge rusher to get your depth up there. Servassier Dennis, the pit man, is that linebacker in this class, and then of course cornerback and even wide receiver, where we saw some guys coming up big. Where I think it was the big guy everyone was talking was Jaden Reed from Michigan State. His route running was insane in the practices. So
yeah, let's see how these one-on-ones go with the receivers and the corners, and if anybody kind of works their way up draft boards just by their drill work at down there at the Senior Bowl.
Right, that's where I'm at, is that we'll keep watching these drills and these practices to see who stands out, because that's how guys like Christian Watson stood out and became a second-round pick for the Packers last year. That's where it's going to be interesting. But the Senior Bowl, it's always a fun time to kind of get more steps in learning about the guys in the process. And then, of course, the NFL Combine, not too far off. That's going to be the big day. Will you be in Indianapolis for that, Brian, or are you staying here?
I think I'm going to stay here this year. Been to Indy a couple times for the Combine, now with two little ones. Probably easier for me to stay home this year and help out the wife with the kids. But yeah, I'm pretty sure Gerry Dulac will be there. So always fun to see what comes out of the Combine. That's when, to your point, Chris, we'll get everybody in this draft class in one place. And a lot of those candidates for the Steelers' #1 pick will be out there in Indy.
Absolutely. We'll talk more about that on Friday in the North Shore Drive podcast when Ray Fittipaldo gives us his reporting and his opinions on what he saw down there. Because it's not just the players and how they play, it's who the coaches who are visiting the Steelers. Mike Tomlin, Omar Khan, where was all there.
People watching,
people watching, seeing who's talking to whom and what relationships might be the most important to keep track of. We'll do that on the Friday episode. Thanks again for Brian for joining us on the Wednesday episode of the North Shore Drive podcast. We're from the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, Chris Carter and Brian Batko. If you enjoyed this show, like the video on YouTube, subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of our daily content from the Post-Gazette, as well as our Wednesday, Friday episodes of North Shore Drive. We're back Friday with Ray Fittipaldo. We'll see you then.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of the North Shore Drive podcast of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. If you're watching this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our YouTube channel. For 6 months of digital access to post-gazette.com for just $6, click the link down below in the description.